Thank you, Bill. We're going to look at two passages out of the Old Testament. We're going to look at Genesis 15, the covenant that God made with Abraham. And in the New Testament, we're going to look at the second half of the Sermon on the Mount, which we won't look at every verse, but we will read some of the key verses. And so Stan's going to read out of Genesis 15, the whole chapter. And we've already been introduced last week to Abram, and we're going to learn a lot more. Of course, he becomes the father of faith, and that's before the old covenant and all of that promise. And we're going to explore a little bit about, we'll discuss a little bit what's the difference between a covenant and a contract and some of those kind of things. And so anyway, think about Genesis chapter 15 as Stan reads for us now.
After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very good reward. But Abram said, O sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, you have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him. This man will not be your heir, but a son coming from your own body will be your heir. He took him outside and said, look up in the heavens and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. And then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. He also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of the Ur of the Chaldees to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abram said, O sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? And so the Lord said to him, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then birds of the prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. And then the Lord said to him, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated 400 years. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, to your descendants, I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgasites, and Jebusites.
All right. At this point, I know all of you are so glad you don't have to read that out loud.
Must have been a sight to behold.
Say that again, John.
I said it must have been a sight to behold.
Yeah.
All those sights.
Right. I tried to. Took me a while to get that one. That's good. I'm a little slow sometimes.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
Yeah.
It kept saying side. Oh.
Well, as we think about this, Abram has this big promise, this big covenant, and it's in some ways it's a different kind of a covenant than we might think of. We typically will talk about the covenant. We'll talk about the old covenant, the new covenant. This was a covenant in the old covenant, and Noah's covenant with God, or God's sign with Noah was a rainbow. They had never destroyed the world or the earth by by water again, but we know that it's going to be destroyed by fire eventually. The second one, the other covenant, is this one, and it's a different kind of a covenant that in some ways is a covenant that covers both the old covenant and the new covenant, because we have God's promise to Abram that he's going to be blessed a long time, but he tells him through this there's going to be some rough times, like the being oppressed 400 years and bad things through that time, but also in the end of that they're going to have some possessions and a land and a lot of things fulfilled. And when we read the New Testament, we realize that we are saved by faith, that same faith that was promised to Abram at this point. So anyway, I forgot to ask the two big questions. What do we learn about God, and what do we learn about people?
God made a lot of stars.
Yes. And I'm sure that you guys, just like Abraham, will try to count them tonight.
Yes, sir.
There's more stars and more grains of sand. So it's in some ways it's just a mind-boggling thing to think, okay, Abram thought he just wanted a child of his own, and God says, hey, my promises are bigger and better than all of that. So good point, Jim. Any other thing we learn about God or people?
God has a plan.
Yes, and it may not be all fulfilled in our lifetime. It's bigger than any of us, although what a blessing, all of us are a part of it. And God has a plan that will be successful. Anything else stand out to you guys? Well, let's explore this concept of covenant. To me, we have Hebrews talks about wills and that type of thing. We have a covenant relationship with God, which is more than just a contract. To me, a covenant is a superior promise. And part of a covenant is both parties have responsibilities or commitments. And they're not enforced necessarily. I'm talking out loud here, thinking out loud. Not just by a contract or a document. It's about a relationship and about trust and about faith. And both parts keeping their bargain. Obviously, God asked Abraham to sacrifice the 3-year-old cow and the female goat and the 3-year-old ram, and then to bring about a turtle dove and a young pigeon and all of that. There's some, and Abraham did that. Now, a lot of people, and there are people in the denominational world that would say we can't earn our salvation. I think the Bible is clear about that, but that doesn't mean we have no responsibility. We exercise our faith, and it's not just saying, I believe. It is a commitment. It's a response on our part, and responding the way God wanted us to respond. Obviously, through the old covenant, the children of Israel did what God wanted them to do. Sometimes they ritualized it, and it became just a ritual rather than about a relationship. But very clearly in the new covenant, our relationship to God is through Jesus. And he is the seed that Galatians and others would talk about. And through Christ, we become the children of God as well. So we have a responsibility. It's not by faith. I started saying not by faith only. And I think that has to be properly defined. James says we're not saved by faith alone. We have to act on that faith, our obedience. But it's more than just a rote obedience. It's a response to God's love and doing our part. So you may want to expound on that a little bit more about what a covenant is versus just a legal document. Nobody want to expound on that?
A covenant is a legal binding relationship between two parties. A marriage is called a covenant in the book of Malachi, actually pronounced Malachi, but that's all right. And which means my messenger. But a covenant is a legal binding relationship. In the case of the book of Deuteronomy, actually, which is called the second law, is a lengthy covenant, the whole book. And it is like a covenant that would be made between a king and his subjects, where the king would make promises of protection and providence and other things to those that were his subjects. And then he would make laws for them. His task was to provide for them and to protect them. Their task was to obey the law. And it's interesting that in the study of Deuteronomy, there are a number of statements like love, carefully keeping the commandments, keeping all of the commandments, and being exact in keeping them. In other words, you don't just do it any way you want to, you do it the way you're told. And all of those ideas come out in the Old Testament covenant, and that covenant is important. But it was a covenant, again, that was sacrificed. There was blood in this covenant made with Abraham in the original. And there was blood that was sacrificed when they made the covenant at Sinai. And of course, there was blood sacrificed in the new covenant as well.
Very good. Appreciate those comments, Phil. Anybody else want to explore a little bit more on this this passage of Genesis 15?
Yes.
Yes, Wiley.
Okay. Between verse 12 and verse 14, talks about how the Israelites will be leaving Egypt because of their distress there. But notice in verse 16, it says, in the fourth generation, your descendants will come back here. And I think they're talking about Jacob and his family. But it says, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. Now they came down there because of the drought that they were having, the famine. So what is this about the Amorites? Can anybody tell me that?
I knew that somebody was going to ask that. That's a good question. So I'm going to let Kent Risley answer that one. No, Kent's not here tonight.
That's a Phil question.
Yes.
That's a Phil question, and Phil has got an answer. So,
But you'll notice that he's going to give them the land of the Amorite. But this land that was given to them and these particular Canaanites, that's the general term for all of these groups, they had committed sins. The reason they lost their land and it was given to the Jews was because of their sin. But God didn't act many times. You find this in the same situation, 722 with the northern tribes, again in 605, 597 and 587 or 6, depending on how you date it, where he destroys Jerusalem. But he doesn't destroy Jerusalem until his time. He was willing to be patient with them. But there would always be a day where the day of judgment came. And this day of the Amorite, they apparently had sinned against God in many ways, but it was not a day of judgment until God was ready to punish them.
I was wondering about the reason why they would put that little phrase in there.
I think it's because of the nature of God. In a situation with Jonah, yet 40 days and Nineveh will be destroyed. But the people repented and God relented. And there are times in which God says, okay, I'm going to put up with this for a little while, but I'm not going to put up with it forever. And when the time comes for God to act, he does. And he did even with his own people, Israel, both the northern tribes and also the southern tribes in Jerusalem. And of
Do you
course, they
think-
went into exile for 70 years.
Do you think Abram knew about the Amorites?
I do not know how much they would. People who were traders, who would go from country to country, nation to nation, tribe to tribe, and would trade various things, buyers and sellers. These were people who usually carried the news of what went on in the other places. So it could very well be that the word of mouth had spread. But regardless of that, Abraham, well, God, whatever you tell me, that's the way it's going to be. And I think that's probably the way he accepted it. But they were more aware of things than we might suspect, because of the people who traveled from place to place would tell the stories. If you were going into somebody's house and they were being hospitable to you, one of the things that you as the guest of that house would be expected to do is to tell all the news about the other places that you know. That's the way that they would further things along. Of course, some things were rumors, but some things were real. But that's how they spread the word in ancient times.
All right.
Okay,
Kevin,
Thank you, guys. I was looking at a footnote there, or a note that was saying that the Amorites were pretty wicked, as
Yes, they were.
people have done research now and confirmed that how wicked it was. So God is patient, but God is, Avon Malone used to say, God is a good God, but he's not a goody-goody God. Behold the goodness and the severity of the Lord. God's a great God, but if you go against him, you're going up against the greatest power of all. So,
hey, Kevin,
yes, sir.
I've got verse 6 there. It says, Abraham believed the Lord and he credited it to him as righteousness.
Right.
James also quotes that scripture there in the second chapter, and it's apparently important, but the definition of credited, what does that mean? Can you elaborate some on that?
Just in a general sense, and I don't know what the Hebrew word is, but in a general sense, it's credited is kind of an accounting term. And I know in the New Testament, it does come from an accounting perspective, but the idea of we have things credited to our account. I don't know if you've ever had that done or not, selling a house or something like that. That's because you sold something. But in Abram's case, because of his righteousness, well, because of his faith, God credited him a righteousness that was not necessarily his own. And we have that same thing in the New Testament. Whenever we live by faith, God credits us, not because we are righteous, but because of Christ, what Christ did for us. He makes us righteous. And of course, part of that covenant relationship is living for him. So
Is it a validation or a certification that he is a righteous believer, a faithful?
good question.
This is a statement of a really kind of a description in God's mind and heart, that he saw something that was really good in him. And he said, that's a righteous man. You see something good in somebody else and you esteem them and reckon this. This is kind of a way of God's describing the kind of person that Abraham was.
Maybe it's a lot like these people who get doctorate degrees from universities that didn't necessarily earn it. It's kind of because of the university recognizing the great scholarship or the great work of somebody.
Kevin,
Yes, Dale?
the covenant that the Lord made with Abram at this time, you notice that he didn't require anything of Abram. Most covenants, you have agreement on both sides, but evidently verse 6 has something to do with Abram's side of that covenant, that he credited it to him as righteousness. And because, it's almost an unconditional covenant, because God didn't make any conditions on it at that point.
That's exactly right. This is like the rainbow. There are no conditions for the rainbow. And this is a one-sided covenant that God makes. And unlike the older and the new covenant of the Old Testament and the New Testament.
True.
It's kind of interesting talking about his righteousness. It wasn't too many chapters back, just a couple of chapters back, where we see Abram lie about his wife and that type of thing. So he was not perfect.
No.
But he did have faith, and as Phil said, God recognized that faith.
And this statement about Abraham and him being credited, his faith being credited to him as righteousness, is brought up in Galatians and Romans as well as James.
Yes.